On September 3, 1260, the Mamluk commander Baibars rode his horse up a winding, rocky trail that snaked through the hills of northern Palestine. The morning sun had just begun to peek over the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the Israel Valley below. Upon reaching the summit, he found Sultan Qutuz, who awaited him with a small, protective retinue. Their gaze fixed on the valley floor, where a momentous event was soon to unfold. Baibars sensed the future. In a few hours, his modest cavalry force would confront an adversary that had never been truly defeated in battle, an enemy that had conquered lands from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, an enemy that had obliterated entire kingdoms, burned cities, and left millions dead in its wake. The Mongols were advancing, confident in their inevitable victory. But Baibars held a secret. It wasn't a hidden weapon. It wasn't superior numbers or better training. The secret lay beneath his horse's hooves, in the stony earth of this ancient land, in the hills surrounding this valley. And in something so simple that the Mongols had never anticipated it. Today, we will recount the tale of how the terrain itself, the very earth, became the weapon that shattered an empire. This is the story of Ain Jalut, and I can assure you, it is not the story you think you know. Before we delve into one of humanity's most pivotal battles, I want to ask you for something. If you appreciate narratives where underdogs triumph through cunning rather than brute force, where geography becomes a central character in historical drama, please hit the like button. And if you desire more in-depth analyses of battles that altered the course of history, subscribe and ring the bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what is coming. Now, let's turn back the clock 2 years to grasp just how impossible this victory seemed. In 1258, Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, had stood for 500 years. It was home to the House of Wisdom, where scholars from across the known world converged to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Abbasid Caliphate governed from this magnificent city, and its caliph was revered as the spiritual leader of millions of Muslims from Spain to India. The city's libraries housed hundreds of thousands of books, representing centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Then came the Mongols. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led an army estimated at over 100,000 men to Baghdad's walls. Caliph al-Mustasim made a catastrophic error. He believed his city's defenses were impenetrable. He believed his prestige as an Islamic leader would protect him. Perhaps he believed God would intervene. He was wrong on all counts. When Baghdad fell in February 1258, the Mongols systematically obliterated everything that made it great over the course of a week. They cast so many books into the Tigris River that eyewitnesses claimed the water turned black from the ink. They executed scholars, artists, and academics. They killed so many people that estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million souls. The caliph himself was wrapped in a rug and trampled by horses, as Mongol superstition forbade royal blood from spilling directly onto the earth. Consider that for a moment. The heart of Islamic civilization, a city that had endured longer than any European capital, was wiped from the map in a matter of days. And the Mongols marched onward, as if merely ticking another item off their world-conquering checklist. But here's what you need to grasp. Baghdad was not an anomaly. This was standard operating procedure for the Mongol war machine. From 1206, when Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, to 1260, the Mongols conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The medieval Persian historian Juvayni wrote that the Mongols were so at ease in the saddle that they seemed to be a single entity, like the centaurs of Greek mythology. Yet, the true genius of their system lay elsewhere. Every Mongol cavalryman brought 3 to 4 horses on campaign. Some sources suggest each had up to 7 spare mounts. Unlike a European knight who rode a single tired horse, Mongols constantly switched to fresh steeds. The Mongol army could cover up to 60 miles a day, twice the capability of a medieval force. They materialized where their arrival seemed impossible, delivered devastating blows, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The Mongol horses themselves were perfectly adapted to this lifestyle. Unlike the large European war horses or elegant Arabian steeds, the Mongol pony was small and stocky, standing only about 137 centimeters at the shoulder. However, it compensated for its modest size with incredible endurance. These horses could survive on minimal fodder, content with scarce grass they managed to find. They easily endured extreme temperatures, from unbearable summer heat to Siberian -40 degrees Celsius in winter. These X-century all-terrain vehicles were fundamentally engineered for endurance, not for bursts of speed or aesthetic appeal. One particular detail, seemingly incredible yet rigorously documented in primary accounts, stands out as remarkably peculiar. Should the need arise, a Mongol warrior could make a minor incision in his horse's neck, draw a small amount of blood for sustenance, seal the wound, and continue his journey. The Persian chronicler Malik Juvayni recorded that a Mongol horseman could operate for up to 10 days without cooked food, subsisting on equine blood and mare's milk. This rendered a slow supply convoy unnecessary, thereby freeing the Mongol army from the burden of defending vulnerable provisions or being hampered by logistical constraints. Consider the immense strategic implications. European armies were confined to roads due to their cumbersome supply trains. They needed to remain close to settlements for resupply. Their movements were sluggish, predictable, and easily tracked. In stark contrast, the Mongols could traverse deserts, cross mountains, and materialize in places where an army was thought incapable of existing. In the medieval epoch, they were the closest equivalent to a contemporary airborne cavalry unit, highly mobile, self-sufficient, and capable of striking anywhere, at any time. Their combat methodologies were equally revolutionary. The Mongol army was structured with mathematical precision, divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. This decimal system facilitated intricate battlefield maneuvers, unimaginable for the feudal armies of Europe or the Middle East, where knights often fought as individuals for personal glory, rather than as cohesive units. A typical Mongol battle strategy unfolded somewhat like this. Light cavalry, armed with powerful composite bows, would wear down the adversary from a distance, unleashing a barrage of arrows while remaining out of range. When the enemy pressed forward, the Mongols would execute their renowned feigned retreat. They would turn and flee, creating the impression of a complete rout, luring their opponents into pursuit. The enemy, believing victory was within grasp, would break formation to chase the retreating Mongols. This is where the trap sprang. The fleeing Mongols would abruptly wheel around, firing their bows backward from horseback, using the so-called Parthian shot. Meanwhile, heavier Mongol cavalry, concealed nearby, would flank the now disorganized enemy. Mongol mounted archers could encircle enemy formations, raining down arrows from all directions, yet maintaining sufficient mobility to evade counterattacks. This tactic was devastatingly effective against every foe, from Chinese pikemen to European knights and Muslim cavalry. In the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223, the Mongols employed this exact strategy against a coalition of Russian princes. The Russians, confident in their numerical superiority, pursued what they believed to be a defeated Mongol force. The Mongols led them across the steppes for 9 days. By the time the trap closed, the Russian horses were exhausted. Their forces were stretched out in a vulnerable line of march, far from any support. Subutai's Mongols annihilated them. Of the 80,000 Russians who entered the battle, only a minuscule fraction survived. Psychological warfare held as much significance as their military methods. The Mongols cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared. Their populations were permitted to live under Mongol rule. Resisting cities were obliterated. Their inhabitants were massacred down to the last child. Buildings were burned, and fields were sown with salt. The Mongols wanted everyone to understand resistance was futile, and capitulation was the only rational choice. By 1260, this strategy had been successfully employed for over half a century. No one had devised a permanent way to halt their advance. Of course, tactical defeats occurred. The Mongols lost some battles, but they invariably returned stronger, learning from their errors and ultimately crushing anyone who opposed them. They vanquished all types of adversaries: steppe nomads who fought similarly to themselves, Chinese infantry equipped with advanced siege weaponry, European heavy cavalry, and Muslim mounted archers. They demonstrated their martial prowess in every conceivable environment, from the Siberian tundra to the Iraqi deserts. Following the capture of Baghdad, the Mongols advanced westward into Syria. Damascus, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, opened its gates without resistance in March 1260. The Christian Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia and the Crusader Principality of Antioch had already submitted to Mongol authority and provided auxiliary troops. Thus, the Mongols controlled vast territories spanning from Korea to the Mediterranean. Only one major Muslim power remained, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which the Mongols intended to absorb into their domain. To grasp the essence of the Mamluks' identity and their rationale for resisting surrender, one must delve into one of the most distinctive social structures of medieval Islamic society. The term Mamluk literally translates from Arabic as owned or slave. Mamluks originated as enslaved boys, typically acquired from Turkic populations in Central Asia or the Caucasian region. These youths, generally between 8 and 12 years old, were bought by Muslim rulers and transported to Egypt, where they underwent a profound transformation. They were enrolled in a sort of military academy, often for years, sometimes decades. Their curriculum included horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and wrestling. They were trained to shoot arrows with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. They studied tactics and strategy, memorized the Quran, and embraced Islam. During this period, powerful bonds of camaraderie formed among them, lasting throughout their lives. This is where the paradox lies, one that might seem contradictory to modern sensibilities. Despite their formal status as slaves, Mamluks achieved high social standing. The most skilled among them could rise to become generals, governors, or even sultans. In fact, in 1250, Mamluks overthrew their Ayyubid overlords in Egypt and established their own sultanate. Former slaves became rulers. Yet, they never forgot their origins. They remembered the rigorous training, the bonds of brotherhood, and the absolute discipline instilled in them from childhood. In many respects, they were a perfect mirror of the Mongols. Warriors raised in the saddle, understanding steppe warfare, fighting as cohesive units rather than individualists vying for personal glory. In 1260, the Mamluk Sultanate was governed by a man named Qutuz. His personal narrative is noteworthy. Born a prince in Central Asia, he was sold into slavery after the Mongol destruction of his homeland. Through exceptional competence and ruthless determination, he climbed the ranks of the Mamluk system, ultimately seizing power in Egypt in 1259. Therefore, when Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo with a letter demanding Egypt's capitulation, it was not merely a political decision for Qutuz, it was intensely personal. Hulagu's letter deserves quotation, as it fully encapsulates the Mongol mindset of inevitable conquest. It stated, "From the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, you should consider what happened to other countries and submit to us. Have you heard how we conquered a vast empire and purified the land of the disorders that soiled it? We conquered immense territories, slaughtering all people. You cannot escape the terror of our armies. Where will you flee? What road will you use to hide from us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords are like lightning, our hearts are hard as mountains, our soldiers are as numerous as sand. Fortresses will not hold us, and armies will not stop us. Your prayers to God will not help against us. Submit to our commands or face complete destruction." Qutuz read this letter aloud to his council. Some advisors urged surrender. After all, hadn't all who resisted the Mongols been annihilated? Wasn't submission the only logical choice? Egypt was wealthy, yes, but could it truly stand against a horde that had conquered half the world? Qutuz's response was to order the execution of the Mongol envoys, their heads displayed on the Bab Zuela Gate in Cairo for all to see. This was a declaration of war in the starkest terms. There will be no surrender, no negotiations, no compromises. Egypt will either stand or fall in battle. This seems insane now, doesn't it? It appears to be the kind of reckless decision that leads to the annihilation of entire civilizations. But Qutuz possessed knowledge that his advisors didn't fully comprehend. He knew that the Mongols, despite their immense power, were not operating at full strength. In 1259, the great Khan monk had died during a campaign in China. This triggered a succession crisis in Mongolia, and Mongol law required all royal princes to return to Karakoram for the election of a new great Khan. Hulagu Khan had departed Syria in late 1259, taking the bulk of his massive army with him. By some estimates, he withdrew over 100,000 men eastward. He left only a rear guard under the command of his most trusted general, a Nestorian Christian Turk named Kitbuka. Estimates for Kitbuka's troop strength vary widely in medieval accounts. However, modern historians believe he commanded between 10,000 and 20,000 Mongol cavalry, supplemented by auxiliary forces from Georgia, Armenia, and Syria. Certainly, this was a formidable army. These Mongols were veterans who had conquered territories from Baghdad to Damascus. Nevertheless, it was a mere fraction of the force that had terrorized the Muslim world for 2 years. Qutuz recognized his opportunity. Should he act with haste, he might engage Kitbuka's vanguard before Hulagu returned with reinforcements. This presented a calculated danger, yet it was the only avenue that held out any prospect of success. He gathered a force of roughly 20,000 Mamluk cavalrymen, bolstered by auxiliary Bedouin units and other voluntary recruits. What followed next truly underscored the desperate and precarious nature of his situation. He initiated discussions with the Crusaders. Just imagine the sheer anomaly of this circumstance. For decades, the Mamluks and Crusaders had been implacable adversaries, clashing in countless battles for dominion over the Holy Land. Only a few short years prior, they would have gladly slain each other on the spot.
However, when Qutuz's envoys arrived at the Crusader fortress of Acre, they discovered the Crusaders were amenable to a pact. Why? Because the Crusaders had grasped a critical insight. The Mongols posed a far greater menace than the Muslims. Kitbuka had already ravaged the Crusader city of Sidon after a minor skirmish, and the Crusaders understood that if Egypt fell, they would inevitably be next. It was preferable to grant the Mamluks passage through Crusader territories than to confront the Mongol horde in isolation. Thus, in July 1260, the Mamluk army advanced northward, unchallenged, through lands controlled by their long-standing enemies. The Crusaders even permitted them to establish supply depots near Acre. This represented one of the most improbable alliances in medieval history, forged purely by the exigencies of survival. Qutuz's army entered Palestine, and it is at this juncture in our narrative that a second pivotal figure emerges, a Mamluk general named Baibars. Baibars stands as one of the most compelling personalities of the medieval era, and I confess, it surprises me that he isn't more widely recognized in the West. Born into a Turkmen family in Central Asia, he was sold into slavery as a child and ascended the Mamluk ranks to become one of their preeminent military commanders. He was extraordinarily ambitious, ruthless, and prepared to do whatever it took to secure victory. But here's a detail crucial for our story. Years earlier, when Baibars fell out of favor with the preceding Mamluk sultan, he fled Egypt and spent some time secluded in Syria and Palestine. He roamed the very region where the impending battle would unfold. He possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain, the hills, valleys, water sources, and narrow defiles. He understood where cavalry could maneuver effectively and where it could not. He held the key to triumph. Working in concert, Qutuz and Baibars devised a strategy that would leverage the Mongols' own tactics against them. Before delving into the battle itself, we should discuss something that appears remarkably mundane but proved utterly decisive: horseshoes. I realize you're here for epic cavalry charges and dramatic heroic battlefield episodes, not a treatise on medieval equine technology. But listen, this seemingly small detail holds the key to everything. Mongol horses, as I noted earlier, were renowned for their incredible stamina and minimal feed requirements. These ponies evolved on the Mongolian steppes, where the ground was predominantly soft and grassy. Their hooves, shaped over millennia of natural selection for this particular environment, were robust and tough. Mongols had no need for horseshoes on the steppe. The soft ground actually promoted the natural strengthening of their hooves. However, Mongolia and Syria are vastly dissimilar geologically. Syria belongs to the Levantine region, characterized by rocky hills,
limestone outcrops, and compact soil. When unshod horses repeatedly traverse such terrain, their hooves crack, chip, and become painfully bruised. A horse with damaged hooves moves slower, tires more quickly, and in severe cases becomes entirely lame. The Mamluks, conversely, had campaigned in this region for generations. Their horses were shod, their hooves protected from the rocky ground by iron horseshoes. This seemingly trivial difference had enormous strategic implications. On the rocky terrain of Syria and Palestine, Mamluk horses could move faster, fight longer, and maneuver more effectively than their Mongol counterparts. But the Mongols also faced a second, more fundamental issue: grass. Do you recall my mention that a Mongol cavalryman might possess 3 to 4 horses, each requiring approximately 4 kilograms of grass daily? Let's do the math. If Kitbaka commanded 15,000 Mongol cavalrymen, and each had 3 horses, that equates to 45,000 horses. At a consumption rate of 9 pounds of grass per horse per day, the total daily feed requirement surpasses 400,000 pounds. Grazing such a vast number of animals would demand around 8 square miles of fertile pastureland. Mongolia, of course, is abundant in such lands. It is even referred to as the Eurasian steppe. Vast stretches of pastureland extended for hundreds of miles across Mongolia, enabling the nomadic people to effortlessly sustain their immense herds. Syria, in sharp contrast, presented a largely arid and semi-desert landscape. While certain localized areas boasted meadows, these were nothing like the boundless grasslands the Mongols were accustomed to. Contemporary estimations suggest that the Syrian terrain could support a maximum of 80,000 horses before overgrazing became a critical issue. This calculation assumed horses were merely grazing, not factoring in the demands of combat and strenuous forced marches. Consequently, the Mongols were unable to bring their usual vast numbers of mounts into Syria, nor could they employ their standard tactic of constantly replacing tired steeds with fresh ones. Their animals were pushed harder on more challenging terrain and suffered from an inadequate food supply. The Mamluks were acutely aware of this vulnerability. Historical accounts indicate that Mamluk forces in some regions adopted a scorched earth policy, actively burning pastures to deny them to the Mongols. This medieval resource deprivation strategy proved surprisingly effective. Now, let's examine the terrain of the Jezreel Valley itself, where the landscape was intentionally weaponized. The Jezreel Valley, a triangular plain in northern Israel, spans approximately 30 miles from Mount Carmel in the west to the Jordan River Valley in the east. This fertile region has, over centuries, been the site of countless conflicts precisely because it offers a natural passage for invasions. Any journey from Syria to Egypt would inevitably lead through this valley. However, its unique strategic value lay elsewhere. While the valley floor was relatively flat and open, ideal for cavalry, precisely the kind of terrain the Mongols favored, it was surrounded on all sides by hills and low mountains. Mount Gilboa dominated the south, the hills of Lower Galilee bordered it to the north, and Mount Tabor rose majestically to the northeast. These weren't barren, windswept elevations. They were forested and dotted with rocky formations. The impending battle was destined to unfold near the spring of Ain Jalut, which translates from Arabic as Goliath's Spring. Legend held that biblical David had triumphed over Goliath here millennia prior. This spring was situated in one of the valley's narrowest points, where the surrounding hills converged. Baibars, assessing this topography, recognized a singular opportunity. The valley floor would invariably attract the Mongols, as it represented ideal territory for their cavalry tactics. However, the encircling hills, cloaked in trees and strewn with rocks, offered perfect concealment for an entire army. If the Mamluks could lure the Mongols into the valley and then launch an assault from the heights, they could neutralize the Mongol advantage in mobility and force them to engage on ground better suited for heavy cavalry and infantry. This ambitious plan demanded flawless timing, unyielding discipline, and no small measure of good fortune. Yet, it represented their only viable path to victory. On the night of September 2, 1260, Qutuz strategically positioned the main contingent of his forces in the hills surrounding Ain Jalut, expertly concealing them amidst the trees and rocky outcrops. Baybar was tasked with leading a small vanguard, perhaps totaling a few thousand horsemen, and deploying them within the valley itself as bait. Upon the Mongols' arrival, Baibars would engage them, provoke them, and then execute a feigned retreat, enticing them deeper into the valley, towards the hills where Qutuz awaited with the primary army. This was a classic Mongol tactic, now being turned against them. The apprentice was poised to deliver a painful lesson to the master. If you enjoyed this account and are interested in more stories where historical research meets cinematic storytelling, please leave your comments below. Tell me, if you were Baibars, awaiting the Mongol army with a tiny detachment while your main army lay hidden in the hills, what thoughts would be running through your mind? Because that was precisely the predicament he faced. As dawn broke on September 3rd, 1260, the sun ascended over the Jezreel Valley that September morning, and Qutuz's Mongol army approached from the north. The Mongol commander was brimming with absolute confidence. He had fought alongside Hulagu Khan for decades. He had played a key role in the conquest of Baghdad. He had witnessed Damascus surrender without a fight. He commanded battle-hardened veterans who had never known definitive defeat. When scouts reported Mamluk forces blocking the valley ahead, Qutuz likely smiled. Finally, the Egyptians intended to stand and fight, rather than cower behind walls. This would be resolved swiftly. Qutuz's army wasn't composed solely of Mongols. It also included auxiliary units from subjugated regions. It comprised Armenian cavalry, Georgian Christian militias, and Syrian warriors. However, the Syrians were relegated to the reserves. Qutuz harbored a degree of distrust towards them, fearing they might defect if the tide of battle turned unfavorably. Baibars, surveying the valley with his small vanguard, must have felt his throat constrict as the Mongol army spread out. Even though Qutuz, with the main Mamluk forces, was hidden in the mountains as part of the overall strategy, the sight of the Mongol army in battle formation would have been terrifying. The Mongols adopted their usual alignment. Light cavalry with composite bows formed the front ranks, poised to shower arrows upon the foe. Behind them, heavy cavalry waited, ready to exploit any weakness. This tactic had proved successful for 50 years against all adversaries. Yet, Baibars possessed a hidden advantage unknown to Qutuz. Baibars had positioned his units so that the Mongols would face the rising sun in the east. The morning rays would strike their eyes, making it difficult to clearly track the Mamluks' movements. This seemingly minor detail, in the chaos of battle, could become a significant benefit. The battle began with Baibars executing exactly what Qutuz anticipated. His cavalry charged forward to meet the Mongol advance. Arrows filled the air from both sides, men and horses screamed, and the ground trembled under thundering hooves. But Baibars didn't intend to win this initial skirmish. He aimed to provoke the Mongols, to needle them, to throw them off balance. His horsemen would attack, release a volley of arrows, and then retreat before the Mongols could engage in close combat. This was the classic hit-and-run tactic, designed to wear down and enrage the enemy, and it succeeded. For several hours, Baibars' small force harassed the Mongols, alternately attacking and withdrawing, but never committing to a full-scale confrontation. The Mongols, accustomed to foes who either fled outright or stood their ground to the death, were utterly infuriated by this. They craved a decisive battle. They wanted to leverage their tactical and numerical superiority to crush these annoying forces once and for all. Qutuz ordered a more vigorous assault. He sent more cavalry into the fray, exerting greater pressure, attempting to pin down Baibars' contingent and destroy it. The Mamluks fiercely resisted, but they were outnumbered and began to fall back. And then, precisely as planned, Baibars signaled a retreat. His cavalry turned and galloped down the valley southwards toward the hills where Qutuz awaited. To the Mongols, this seemed precisely what they expected. The Mamluks had fought bravely, but faltered under pressure. Now was the moment to pursue, to destroy the fleeing enemy before they could regroup. Qutuz commanded the pursuit. The Mongol cavalry, anticipating victory, surged after the retreating Mamluks. This was their forte, the chase, the hunt, the ultimate destruction of a broken adversary. Their blood surged, They yearned for the kill. Baibars' cavalry sped down the valley, relentlessly pursued by the Mongols. The valley narrowed as they approached Ain Jalut. Hills pressed in on both sides, with trees and rocks dotting the slopes. But the Mongols barely noticed them. All their attention was fixed on the Mamluks fleeing ahead. From a hilltop, Qutuz watched as the Mongol army poured into the valley like water into a bottle. This was the crucial juncture. If he sprang the trap too soon, the Mongols might escape the valley. If he delayed, his vanguard would be annihilated, and the Mongols might realize they were ambushed. He waited. The tension must have been unbearable. His officers looked to him, awaiting the signal. The Mongols drew closer to the Mamluks' hidden positions in the hills. Closer. Closer. And then Qutuz gave the command, and the hills erupted with warriors. From three sides, Mamluk cavalry and infantry burst from their cover among the trees and rocks. Battle drums thundered. Arabic war cries echoed off the valley walls. The Mongols, stretched out in a long marching column, suddenly found themselves encircled. To their credit, the Mongols did not panic. These were seasoned soldiers who had faced ambushes before. They attempted to pivot and form a defensive circle, using their discipline and training to fight their way out. But they were fighting uphill, literally. The Mamluks charged from the hills, and gravity added force to their assault. The rocky terrain, which had slowly worn down the unprotected hooves of the Mongol ponies, now became a serious impediment. Horses stumbled over loose stones. They slipped on the uneven ground. Damaged hooves made them slower and less agile. Meanwhile, the Mamluk horses, protected by their iron shoes, galloped fearlessly across the stony slopes. The Mamluks unleashed a devastating barrage of arrows from all directions. The Mongol cavalry tried to return fire with their bows, but they were shooting uphill under attack from three sides. Then the Mamluks deployed a weapon the Mongols had never encountered: hand cannons. These early firearms, known as midfa in Arabic, were primitive by modern standards. These crude devices were essentially metal tubes, packed with gunpowder, designed to launch a projectile with a loud bang and a cloud of smoke. Accuracy was not their strong suit, nor were they meant to directly eliminate numerous Mongols. Their primary function was to create panic among the horses. Mongol war horses were exceptionally disciplined in battle, impervious to the cries of wounded fighters or the clash of steel. Yet they had never encountered the explosive roar of gunpowder weapons. When the metfa fired, the Mongol steeds reared, bucked, and scattered, throwing their riders and disrupting formations. Into this emerging chaos, the formidable Mamluk cavalry charged the disoriented Mongol lines. Here, the Mamluks' larger horses and heavy armor proved to be decisive advantages in close quarters. Their powerful cavalry could literally sweep aside the lightly armed Mongol riders. Mamluk armor withstood blows that would have been fatal to less protected Mongols. Their lances and swords, optimized for close-range combat, were more effective in the thick of the fight than the Mongols' composite bows. The battle raged for hours. The Mongols, to their enduring credit, fought with astonishing ferocity. They managed to breach the Mamluks' left flank, pushing back the Egyptian forces and threatening to split the Mamluk army in two. This marked the pivotal moment of the confrontation. Had the Mongols succeeded in breaking through and escaping the encirclement, they might have regrouped and reversed the tide of battle, as they had done against other adversaries in the past. Sultan Qutuz, observing from his position with the reserves, recognized the peril and made a decision that showcased him as more than merely a competent commander. He was a leader who understood that sometimes everything must be put at stake. He removed his helmet. In medieval warfare, commanders wore distinctive helmets and armor so their troops could identify them amidst the maelstrom of battle. By taking off his helmet, Qutuz made himself a target. He also ensured that each of his soldiers could see his face. Then, he rode directly into the most perilous part of the battle, where the Mongols had broken through. His bodyguards attempted to stop him, but he spurred his horse onward. As he galloped forward, he reportedly cried out, "O soldiers of Islam! O defenders of the faith!" The impact was profound. Witnessing their sultan, helmetless and exposed, plunging into the heart of the fray, the Mamluk warriors rallied. The wavering left flank held firm, and fresh troops poured into the breach. The Mongol penetration was halted, then repelled. It was then that what Kitbuka had feared from the outset occurred. The Syrian auxiliary troops in his army defected. These were men who had been forced to fight for the Mongols after their cities were conquered. They harbored no affection for their Mongol overlords. They had fought only because resistance seemed futile. But now, seeing the Mongols surrounded and, for the first time, on the defensive, the Syrians seized their opportunity. They turned their weapons against the Mongols and sided with the Mamluks. The Mongol army, already struggling, now found itself fighting enemies within its own ranks. The situation became hopeless. Kitbuka, the Mongol general, must have realized by this point that the battle was lost. Chroniclers recount that some of his officers urged him to flee, to escape and fight another day. But Kitbuka refused. He had served Hulagu Khan loyally for many years. He had helped conquer an empire. He would not die fleeing. He continued to fight, even as the Mongol army disintegrated around him. An arrow struck his horse, and the animal fell. Kitbuka tumbled to the ground, surrounded instantly by Mamluk soldiers. Different accounts detail what happened next. Some sources claim he died fighting, sword in hand, taking several Mamluks with him. Others state he was captured alive and brought before Qutuz. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, when the captured Kitbuka was brought to Qutuz, the Sultan declared, "You have shed so much innocent blood, ended the lives of chieftains and dignitaries, overthrown ancient dynasties, and now you yourself have fallen into a trap." Kitbuka's response exemplified the absolute conviction that had sustained the Mongols through decades of conquests. "Even defeated, even captured," he retorted, "if I perish by your hand, I consider it an act of God, not yours. Do not be fooled by this event for a moment, for when news of my death reaches Hulagu Khan, the sea of his wrath will boil, and from Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt, the earth will tremble beneath the hooves of Mongol horses." This was both a threat and a prophecy. His head was then severed directly on the battlefield. Following their general's demise, the Mongol army completely fractured. Those who could escape fled north towards the town of Baisan, 8 miles away. The Mamluks pursued them relentlessly. It was at this point that the rugged terrain, which had hindered the Mongols during the battle, proved utterly catastrophic in their retreat. Exhausted cavalry, with damaged hooves, struggled to escape across unfamiliar stony ground, pursued relentlessly by fresh Mamluk horsemen on shod horses. The outcome was a massacre. The Mongols briefly regrouped near the basin, attempting a final stand, but were overwhelmed. By day's end, the Mongol army, which had conquered lands from Baghdad to Damascus, was virtually annihilated. Thousands of Mongol warriors lay dead in the valley. For the first time in over 50 years, a Mongol army suffered a decisive defeat in open battle and never returned to seek vengeance for their loss. Immediately following the engagement, Qutuz took an action that he knew would resonate throughout the medieval world. He commanded that Kitbuka's head be impaled on a spear and sent to Cairo, where it was put on public display at the Babzuela Gate. Consider the symbolism of this act. Just months prior, Qutuz had executed Mongol envoys and exhibited their heads at those very gates. The Mongols responded by sending their forces, confident that Egypt would fall like any other kingdom that dared to resist them. Instead, the head of their commander now adorned the same gates, a grim retort to Hulagu Khan's threats. News of Ain Jalut spread through the medieval world like wildfire. In Cairo, jubilation filled the streets. In the ruins of Baghdad, in Damascus, in Aleppo, wherever the Mongols had conquered, people began to whisper that perhaps the Mongols were not, after all, invincible. The Mamluks didn't stop at defense alone. Within just a few days of the battle, they advanced north and recaptured Damascus. Less than a month later, they had reclaimed Aleppo. Syria, which had been under Mongol control for only a few months, once again returned to Muslim hands. The Mamluk Sultanate continued to govern Egypt and the Levant for over 250 years. However, the narrative takes an ironic and dark turn here. On his return journey to Cairo, the victory-intoxicated Sultan Qutuz made a fatal error. He had promised Baibars, the commander who devised and executed the brilliant ambush strategy, that he would be rewarded with Syria as his own domain to administer. But Qutuz either changed his mind or told Baibars to wait. We don't know the exact words exchanged. What we do know is that Baibars, an ambitious and ruthless commander who had just saved the Islamic world, conspired with other Mamluk officers. On October 24, 1260, less than 2 months after the great triumph at Ain Jalut, Baibars and his accomplices assassinated Qutuz during a hunting expedition. They claimed the killing was justified because Qutuz failed to uphold his promises. But let's be honest about what it was: an assassination fueled by ambition and greed. Baibars then declared himself the new Sultan of Egypt. And you know what? He proved quite effective in the role. Under his rule, the Mamluks would complete the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land, capturing Acre in 1291 and ending 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant. He would thwart subsequent Mongol attempts to invade Syria. He would transform the Mamluk Sultanate into the dominant power in the Middle East for many generations. Yet, I can't help but reflect on Qutuz. This was a man enslaved by the Mongols, who rose through the Mamluk system, who made the bold decision to fight rather than surrender, who risked everything to confront an seemingly invincible foe. He won a battle that saved Islamic civilization in the Middle East and North Africa, and his reward was to be murdered by his own subordinate. History can be so messy. It doesn't always provide the neat, morally satisfying endings we crave. Qutuz deserved to be remembered as a hero, but he died weeks after his greatest triumph, killed by a man he had elevated and trusted. Meanwhile, in Azerbaijan, Hulagu Khan received word of the catastrophe at Ain Jalut. As Kibuka had predicted, he was enraged. He immediately began planning a massive invasion to avenge the defeat and finally crush Egypt. But he never got that chance. Remember I mentioned Berk, the ruler of the Golden Horde in Rus? Berk had converted to Islam and was utterly appalled by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and the execution of the caliph. He viewed this as an unforgivable crime against the Islamic faith. Furthermore, Berk believed that Hulagu had seized territories in the Caucasus that rightfully belonged to the Golden Horde. So, Berk did something unprecedented in Mongol history. He formed an alliance with the Mamluks against his fellow Mongol ruler and declared war on Hulagu. This was a civil war within the Mongol Empire, Mongol against Mongol. In 1263, Hulagu led an army north to confront Berk. 2 Mongol armies clashed in the Caucasus region, and in the ensuing conflict, Hulagu experienced a substantial defeat. He would dedicate the rest of his life to battling Berki's forces in the northern territories. Despite this, he chose not to invade Egypt in the south and passed away in 1265, his ambition of conquering Egypt unfulfilled. His successors made repeated attempts to reclaim Syria. In 1300, Mongol troops briefly captured Damascus again, but they were unable to maintain control. The setbacks were similar to those suffered at Ain Jalut: a scarcity of grazing land for their horses, terrain ill-suited to their combat strategies, and skilled Mamluk defenders who exploited these vulnerabilities. By 1303, after the Mamluks decisively repelled yet another Mongol incursion at the Battle of Marj al-Safar, the Mongols effectively abandoned their campaigns to conquer Egypt and the Levant. Ain Jalut marked the westernmost extent of Mongol expansion, a boundary they never again surpassed. Let's consider the broader historical implications of the Battle of Ain Jalut, as its ramifications stretched far beyond the Middle East. Had the Mongols triumphed at Ain Jalut and proceeded to conquer Egypt, the entire trajectory of Mediterranean history would have been profoundly altered. With Egypt under Mongol dominion, they would have gained a crucial foothold for invading North Africa. To the north, the Mongols had already reached Poland. A Mongol empire spanning from Poland to Morocco would have effectively trapped Europe in a colossal pincer movement. Would the Italian Renaissance have flourished if Mongol armies posed a threat from both east and south? Would the age of European exploration and colonization have materialized if European kingdoms were preoccupied with survival against Mongol invasions? Would Islam have endured as a prominent global faith if its last major power center had been eradicated? These are counterfactual inquiries, and definitive answers remain elusive. Nevertheless, it's worth pondering how different our world might be if he had not been familiar with the lay of the Israeli valley, if Mamluk horses had not been shod, if Syria had possessed more pastures, or if the hills surrounding Ain Jalut hadn't provided ideal cover for an ambush. This battle also vividly illustrates what I believe is crucial for comprehending military history. While tactics and bravery are important, geography and logistics frequently play a more decisive role. The Mongols did not lose at Ain Jalut because they were incompetent warriors. They were exceptional soldiers. They didn't lose due to cowardice or ineptitude. They were courageous and well-disciplined. Their defeat stemmed from the fact that their entire military system was optimized for the specific conditions of the Eurasian steppe. When they encountered a different environment, the advantages that had once made them seemingly invincible transformed into liabilities. Their small, hardy, unshod ponies, capable of surviving in any steppe climate, were less effective on muddy terrain than shod horses. Their strategy of having a vast number of spare horses was unsustainable in land lacking sufficient forage. Their mobility advantage was negated by hills and forests. This is a lesson military strategists have repeatedly had to relearn throughout history. Tactics that work brilliantly in one environment can utterly fail in another. The British recognized this during the American Revolution, when their European linear formations clashed with guerrilla warfare in the North American forests. Americans understood this in Vietnam, when their overwhelming firepower met an adversary who controlled the jungle. The Soviets learned this in Afghanistan, when their mechanized army encountered mountain fighters intimately familiar with every pass and valley. The Mongols were the preeminent military force of their era, but they were not supernatural, nor were they unstoppable. They were human beings employing tactics adapted to their homeland. And when they confronted an enemy who understood both their tactics and the local terrain better than they did, they could be defeated. There's another point I find particularly interesting from a historical perspective that I wish to highlight. The Mamluks triumphed at Ain Jalut by employing the Mongols' own tactics against them, a feigned retreat, an ambush, and exploiting the enemy's overconfidence. These were all maneuvers the Mongols had successfully utilized for decades. He, as a Turk from the Central Asian steppes, undoubtedly grew up hearing tales of Mongol tactics. He understood how they fought because he originated from the same martial tradition. This wasn't a confrontation of East versus West, Christianity versus Islam, or other simplistic narratives we sometimes use to interpret medieval conflicts. It was a battle between steppe warriors, with the fundamental difference that one side knew the terrain and the other did not. Furthermore, I believe it's important to reflect on the role of luck and circumstance in history. Had Mongol Khan not perished in 1259, Hulagu might never have left Syria. Had he remained with his full army of 100,000 men, the Mamluks would have been outnumbered 5-1, and despite any local advantages, they would likely have faced defeat. If Burqa Khan hadn't converted to Islam and allied with the Mamluks against Hulagu, the Mongols might have consolidated their forces for another offensive. History is replete with unforeseen circumstances, where a death, a decision, or an alliance completely alters the course of events. We often prefer historical narratives that present clear cause and effect, distinct heroes and villains, and inevitable outcomes. Yet, the truth is frequently far more intricate and dependent on fortune than we wish to admit. Nonetheless, I do not intend to diminish the bravery and skill of the Mamluk warriors at Ain Jalut. Their adversary had a fearsome reputation, having annihilated every kingdom that resisted them. The Mamluks recognized that defeat would likely consign Cairo to the same fate as Baghdad, utter destruction. They fought with all their might, achieving victory by combining courage with intellect and valor with strategy. And Qutuz, despite the tragic end to his own story, deserves recognition for his audacious choice to fight rather than surrender. Capitulation would have been easily justified. The Mongols offered him continued rule as a vassal. He could have argued that he was saving Egyptian lives by avoiding battle. Instead, he chose combat, a decision that preserved Islamic civilization in the Middle East. Today, if you visit the Ain Jalut battlefield, you will find agricultural land within the Ma'ayan Harod National Park in northern Israel. There are no grand monuments, no tourist centers with souvenir shops and audio guides. The precise location of the battle remains somewhat imprecise, as medieval chroniclers were not noted for their coordinate accuracy. However, the spring still flows, and the hills still surround the valley. If you stand on the slopes of Mount Gilboa and gaze upon the Jezreel Valley, you can envision what Qutuz saw that September morning in 1260. The valley floor, tempting to any cavalry general, the perfect ambush sites in the hills, and the approach of an army that considered itself invincible. The story of Ain Jalut serves as a potent reminder that every empire, no matter its might, possesses limitations. These can be geographical, logistical, or political, but they are invariably present. The Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, found its western frontier in a rocky valley of northern Palestine, where their horses' hooves met unfamiliar ground. It also underscores that local knowledge can be as crucial as numerical superiority or advanced weaponry. Baibars knew the terrain intimately. He understood where to conceal his troops, where to set ambushes, and how to exploit the weaknesses the stony ground would create for unshoed horses. This indigenous understanding, coupled with the boldness to implement it, proved decisive. Perhaps most significantly, Ain Jalut reminds us that history is shaped by choices. Qutuz opted to fight, not to yield. Baibars chose a perilous ambush over open confrontation with the Mongols. Kitbuka decided to pursue the retreating Mamluks, oblivious to the trap. Each of these decisions had consequences that echoed through history. Before I conclude, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Baibars' assassination of Qutuz was justified or an act of betrayal against a hero? Do you think the Mongols could have conquered Europe had they defeated the Mamluks? What other battles in history, in your opinion, merit such in-depth examination? Your comments genuinely help me decide what to cover next, so please don't hesitate. If you enjoyed this video, I ask you for 3 things. First, please hit the like button. It truly helps more people discover these stories. Second, subscribe and click the notification bell, as I'm preparing more stories like this about battles, technologies, and strange geographical features that altered the course of history. And third, share this video with anyone who loves history, because such tales are too good to keep to oneself. Remember, the secret to the Mongols' defeat was not a superweapon or a miracle. It was horseshoes, grass, and rocky hills. It was brilliantly utilized local knowledge. It was the understanding that the ground beneath one's feet can be as vital as the sword in one's hand. The Mongols forged the largest contiguous land empire in history, but at Ain Jalut, they learned that there is always terrain that even the greatest army cannot traverse. Sometimes, topography determines destiny.